Hi everyone. So today we are going to talk about how context is a part of communication. So understanding the overall context to help us be able to communicate better, and then also as interpreters to be able to analyze the situation so that we can provide the best interpretation possible. So context is essentially the who, what, when, where, why, and how of communication, so all of the WH words. And we're going to talk about these individually in just a minute. So keep that in mind, that it's the who, what, when, where, why, how of communication that helps us determine context. So let's start off with where or what is the setting where the communication is going to take place. So the location of the interaction influences the message construction. So for example, in an office environment, certain jargon might be used that others would not understand. So as an example of that, working in a military related environment, there are a lot of acronyms, abbreviations, codes that the peers, the coworkers all understand, but people who are not familiar with that particular office or situation wouldn't necessarily understand. Another example would be having a discussion about sports at home might take place at an intimate register, and we'll talk about register in a different video, or having a discussion about sports in an academic environment, such as at college, where the register would be different. It would probably range between informal and consultative. And so we would be able to talk about the exact same subject in a different setting, and the way we would talk about the subject would be different, if that makes sense. All right. When we also look at context, how is the communication taking place? So communication is impacted by the mode that's being used. And if you think about modes such as face-to-face, texting, using the phone, using email, social media posts, or even video phone right now when we're using FaceTime or other video connections. So if you think about all of the communication cues that exist or are absent in each of the modes listed. So if you go back and think about in-person, face-to-face, what are the communication cues that you would have access to, as opposed to maybe trying to have that same conversation, which through email, and you would be there would be communication cues in one of those styles that exist that don't exist in the other, and so depending on how those cues are missing or there, it impacts the understanding of the communication, right? So as we know, some people misunderstand what they read in email, and that's because they don't have tone of voice, they don't have a face to look at, they don't have eyes to see whether or not there's they don't have a seriousness to the delivery of the information. Email, it's all in their head in how the individual who's the receiver of the email is reading the text, as opposed to the person who's delivering it, how they think they're delivering the text, right? So think about those modes and how communication cues that are there or absent affect communication. Will the conversation be exactly the same and understood the same if the parties are face to face versus taking place by text? I just was speaking of that. Sometimes when we text our families and friends, they don't actually understand what we said to them in the way that we think we sent the message, right? So the receiver of the message uses their own cues to determine how they think the message is being sent to them, where the deliverer of the message may have had a whole different point in what they were trying to say when they delivered it, right? So also what we want to think about too, for those of us who use sign language as our job, our interpreters, or we know deaf people, for the deaf, is communication via an auxiliary service, such as interpreter. How does that come into play with overall communication, right? So sometimes we have interpreters live on site. So you see it in college classrooms, you see it in doctor's offices, et cetera, or on video where they might be using the video relay service to have a telephone conversation with somebody. But if they're doing video relay service, they never actually see the receiver, right? They see an interpreter, and the interpreter is having to hear the tone of voice of the non-deaf person who's on the receiving end, the spoken end of the language, and then they have to understand that tone of voice and then convey that to the deaf person on video. So it's very interesting. And so you'd think about how, for deaf individuals, the communication modes may come into play. So next in the WH questions in part of context is when is the communication happening? And so, you know, we also, sometimes the time of day actually does come into play in the overall context, the day of the week or the month, right? And when we talk about time of day, if you think about talking with somebody in the middle of the day or having a conversation late at night, so interpreters, sign language interpreters, if you work for the video relay service, you're going to find that nighttime conversations, you're going to be interpreting those conversations, and they might be exactly what you think they are. So, which will be entertaining, I'm sure, for you. So time of day does come into play in how we talk to people, right? If you really give that some thought, you'll understand. Other factors of when is such as before, during, or after a meeting, right? If you think about when you're talking to somebody before a meeting, during a meeting, the conversation, the communication style or mode of the communication style probably changes. After the meeting, depending on who you're talking to, the register or the communication style may change again, right? You think about that in a classroom before, during, or after class or at various events. Communicating with someone in a different time zone or location can be a factor. If you think about if you live in California and you're going to talk to somebody on the East Coast, then for them, they're 3 hours later in the day than you are. So if you're talking to them at 9 o'clock at night, it's midnight for them. Spur of the moment communication where there's no appointment. With when you meet somebody and you just start off with communication, that's part of time. When we think about planned communication, so with an appointment, which in fact sometimes those conversations, one of the individuals will rehearse that in their head, right? They're going to think about what they're going to say. So if they're going to go in and have a chat with their boss, and they have an appointment to do so on the next day at noon, then they're going to rehearse that conversation in their head. And then if you as the interpreter show up, then you're going to have to do some quick analysis of what you think is going on to be able to provide the communication effectively. Context. If you think about context, schema is relevant for shared or common experiences. So who are the parties and what is their connection to each other? So if you don't know what the word schema is, it's essentially common or background information that people have. You can look up the word schema in a dictionary or online as well, since nobody uses paper dictionaries anymore. And keep in mind that sensitivity and respect are very important in communication, especially when you as an interpreter are showing up. So consider how any of the following are relevant to understand in order to have effective communication. So for example, the age of the parties. Is one person older than the other? Are they similar in age? Because that will make a difference in a possible comprehension or understanding of the content. And I'll just give a short example of like the TV guide. If I said TV guide to my dad, and I'm at the moment, I'm in my 50s, So if I said TV Guide to my dad, he thinks of an old magazine that was called TV Guide, or he thinks of the Sunday paper that used to have a section that you would pull out and that had the schedule of all the television shows on it for the week. So TV Guide used to be a piece of paper that you would see. And then when cable TV came into play, you would actually see a channel that was called the TV Guide channel. And at the bottom of that channel, the stations and the shows that were going to be on those stations would sort of roll. It was a continuous roll on the bottom of the channel. And then nowadays, many of you, if you're watching TV still, right, because not everybody does, they've gone off to their apps. But if you're watching TV, you click the guide button, and then you get the guide of the channel. So that a lot of that depends on age and for common understanding. If you think about other things to consider is gender identity. And you have, this is where sensitivity and respect come into play for interpreters. You want to make sure that you're speaking appropriately when you're providing interpretations. The status of individuals come into play, such as doctor-patient or a supervisor and a subordinate. If you think about those kinds of conversations, how do those conversations take place? And we'll talk again a little bit about that when we deal with register. And then also cultural identity, how one identifies with culture. That also has an impact on overall communication. The what of context, right? The topic or the subject matter, the content in the communication are all part of context. So for example, a couple of friends at college could be talking about where they're going to go and what they eat for lunch. And yes, as a matter of fact, as an interpreter, you might be interpreting that conversation. Another example, a doctor will be meeting with a young girl and her parents to tell them the diagnosis of a cancer screening. So that's going to impact, that's part of the context. If we think about overall context, where are they? They're going to probably be at the doctor's office. Who's involved? A young girl, her parents, and the doctor. When is this happening? It's happening after a screening has already happened. And then why is this happening? Well, he needs to give them the diagnosis, right? And then how it's happening could be in person. And in the case of if the young girl is deaf and or the parents are deaf, there might be an interpreter there. So all of those are part of context and have to be thought about when we're showing up to assignments. Another example is a judge is going to render a verdict in a high-profile case. So if you think about how that's going to happen, and then how the judge will render the verdict, and then how the news media will get hold of it, and they're going to operate in a different register, and then how the community at large will also talk about that same case. And then another example could be a teenager who's going to have a discussion with his parents about coming out, right? And sometimes when those, and yes, you might have those conversations as an interpreter, maybe not in person, but sometimes over the VRS, over the phone. And those can be sensitive because while coming out has less of a stigma than it used to have, it's for some people, if a teenager tells their parents that they're LGBTQ or part of the queer community or gay community, then they could very well be put out of their house. So that's part of the context of communication. Why are we communicating? Sometimes, some of the goals, these are not all of them, but some of them are to inform, right? If you ever took speech class, you understand that to inform, to influence, to motivate, to inspire, to educate, to praise, all kinds of words of goals for communication. This is just a small list of those. And I'm just going to say interpreters should have a strong sense of quickly understanding the context of an assignment, because interpreters are entering environments to provide communication. However, the interpreter may not have the schema with one or more of those contextual areas, right? We don't always know what we're showing up to, and we need to be able to quickly adapt, be sensitive and respectful, be flexible with what and how things are going to happen, and adaptable, being able to make the changes that are necessary. So be willing to make short notice changes at any time during the assignment. And with that,